Okay, good morning, everybody.
Good morning. Morning, sir.
Usually I say good morning and people carry on talking for 5 minutes and then they finally settle down. And so I have to repeat it a few times. It worked once like a charm this time. That's great. So good morning. It's a real pleasure to be here. I'm very much looking forward to this session and looking forward to interacting with all of you. It's an almost full house. If anyone comes in late, feel free to direct them to the troublemaker chairs at the very front that nobody wants to sit in. So those are the chairs that are backing the presentation screen, so it's very difficult for folks to actually just pay attention as they usually do, and you know, see what's going on. So I'm going to say a couple of things to start with before I introduce myself and get a sense as to who's in the room. First of all, I hate podiums. I'm delighted to see there isn't a podium in the room. I am not going to stand behind this obstructionist because that's not my style. I tend to prefer interacting with my students, my audiences directly. I am an educator by trade. This is what I do. This room's pretty tight. The navigation in between the tables is very close. So I'm not going to direct myself through spaces because that's going to be a problem for reasons that you'll understand in a moment. But if I wander around the periphery, then that's what's going to happen. I think Sebastian tell me if I'm wandering in the wrong way because this session is being video recorded. The mic is oddly cutting in and out every so often. I'm hoping that is not going to interfere too much with the recording. If it cuts out now are not able to hear me effectively, just stop me and tell me. Another piece of ground rule, I'm happy to take questions and conversation as we go along. For that purpose, there is a wireless microphone so that you are picked up by the recording. I have a visual impairment. I'm going to declare this up front, and it's going to be important later. I have a visual impairment. If you raise your hand, you will be ignored because I will not see you. So that's not going to work. I'm happy. So if we weren't being recorded and if I didn't have the microphone, I'd say just go right ahead and interrupt me. But I will need a volunteer to guard this and actually help me facilitate if anyone does have questions and wants to interrupt. Is there a volunteer? This is a group participation moment. Volunteer, perfect. And your name?
Susan.
Susan, nice to meet you.
Oh.
Excellent. All right. So that's that part taken care of. Let's also get a sense as to who's in the room. The room is practically full. There's like, I don't know, 30 odd, 35 odd of you here. So clearly I'm more important than coffee. That's good. Or the topic is more important than coffee, which is even better, frankly. You don't have to be here for me. You have to be here for the topic. Also, clearly, this is more interesting than the other sessions going on at the same time, so I'm happy for that. But I'm sure that the others are playing to a packed house as well. I mean, there's 250 people who are registered, so this room's capacity is 40, unless we start sitting on the floors. Some of you get really comfy chairs, and it's like envy-inducing because I've got to stand and chat with you for the next 90 minutes or 85 minutes. So, all right. So before I formally introduce myself, I'm going to get you to tell me who's in the room. Again, I don't see hands, so when I ask about things, if you raise hands, that's not going to work. So you figure out a way of signaling me that you are part of a group that is here. How many of you are students? Okay, all right. How many of you are faculty? Excellent. How many of you are faculty from OSU? Even better, that's great. K-12 educators. Fantastic. Service providers, as in disability services staff, student services staff, educational assistants in the K-12 space. Alumni and various hangers-on in the post-secondary system that aren't any of the above categories? A very, very tepid set of applause. Anybody else? Any other groups that are here that I have not identified? I'm sorry? Informal astronomy ed. That's the best kind of ed. And even better. Okay. All right. I like that. Okay. You know what? I really should have kept a slide in this presentation that I did not keep in this presentation. And I would have, if I'd known that there was going to be a decent concentration of astronomers, I would have actually kept it because it's kind of cool. You'll hear about it in a moment. Okay. So that tells me who's here. Thank you very much. I usually like to get to know my audiences, and I usually like to get to know the people that I'm interacting with, the people that I'm teaching for the next 80 minutes now. And in this particular case, that's going to be a little bit harder because I don't have the time to get all of your names. So what I'm going to ask you to do is when you want to say something, ask a question, make a comment, offer up a criticism, burn me an effigy, lynch me, whatever you want to do, just let me know who you are first. Give me your name, tell me where you're from, and we'll interact on a first name basis, okay? The other thing I'm going to do, it's always awkward to do this at the very beginning of a presentation before you've gotten to know me and before you've gotten to know the topic. But there's this handy little Ohio State University Office of Student Life tiny, tiny, tiny notebook that came in our tote bags. I love those tote bags, by the way. They've got a zip on them that's fantastic. Nothing's going to fall out. It's great. And so I'm going to pass this tiny notebook around. That's what it's going to be called for the next 80 minutes, tiny notebook. And I'm going to ask you to give me your name, where you're from, and your email address. If you decide at the end of this presentation that you want nothing to do with me, then come up and cross your name off the list. I'm collecting your name because I think it's really important to continue to foster these kinds of communities and conversations around accessibility in STEM. And I'm like, Canadian content, so I'm not from around here. I flew in from another country. Are there any other people from other countries? Yes, perfect, wonderful. Where are you from? Okay, so technically you're from here, but you came from elsewhere before you got here. Okay, fine. Well, fair enough. That still counts. But yeah, I live in another country. Fortunately, it's one just across the border, and it's not as cold as people think. And also, it did just win the NBA championship, so sucks to be you, Cleveland Cavaliers. About bloody time you got rid of LeBron, That's on video recording now. I said it. It's public. So I'm going to pass this around. I'm going to start with, like I said, give me, if you're interested, give me your contact information, your name, where you're from. If you don't want me to have that information at the end because you think I suck, feel free to come up and scratch your name off the list. I can't see who you are, so it wouldn't matter. I make about blindness. They're fun. Feel free to laugh at them. They're sometimes actually quite funny. Sometimes they're not. They're so bloody painful that you can laugh anyway. Okay, so after all of that, who am I? So first of all, you are in the Inclusive Teaching Practice and STEM Education session, Essential Requirements, Universal Design, and Differentiated Instruction in STEM. If this is not where you want to be, please leave now. If this is exactly where you want to be, then don't go anywhere. If there are other people who want to be here who for some reason feel like they can't be, feel free to go and drag them and bring them in. Okay, so my name is Mahadeo. It's a difficult name to pronounce. There's a couple of different ways to do it. M-A-H-E-O. The stress is on the second syllable, the ha, and the E is actually a long A, so it's Mahadeo. Okay? If you say that fast enough, it comes out Mahadeo. That is my name. Feel free to use it. I am the head of research and chief accessibility officer for the Canadian National Institute for the Blind in Canada, as its name suggests. It can't be the Canadian National Institute for the Blind in Barbados, unfortunately. Barbados has a much nicer climate. we'll move on. So I serve as head CAO for the organization. I'm also an assistant professor adjunct in the Department of Ophthalmology in the Faculty of Medicine at University in Kingston, Ontario, due north of here. And so I am the principal investigator on a number of projects that have to do with the accessibility of STEM and science education in the Canadian context. The most prevalent, most recent, and most important of these is a book that was published by Academic Press, which is Elsevier Publishing. It came out in December of 2016, called Creating a Culture of Accessibility in the Sciences. I'm actually giving this presentation on behalf of myself and my primary collaborator, Ainsley Latour, who is not able to be here. She's actually earning a paycheck today. She's working, not able to travel down with me. And so this is actually going to be a presentation based on a fair bit of work that we've done within this space over the past few years. My contact information is on slide number 2 here for folks who are unable to see the slides. I will talk you through them. So my contact information is on the slide. I'm giving you my email address. It's very simple. It's my first name, Mahadeo, dot my last name, Sukhai, so Mahadeo dot Sukhai at cnib.ca. I've also given you my LinkedIn profile. You can search me by name. I'm relatively easily findable, so feel free to connect with me if you have not already done so. And I think there's a couple of you who have. So let me tell you a little bit about myself. I am a geneticist by training. I have an undergraduate degree in molecular genetics. I have a master's degree in molecular pharmacology, and I have a PhD in cancer genetics. I have 2 postdoctoral fellowships to my name, one of them in cancer genomics and the second one in experimental therapeutics. I have a research career that goes from basic research when I started my, my master's all the way out to translational applied research, which is the field that I play in now. My PhD was actually animal models of leukemia. Hopefully there's nobody from PETA in the audience. And my expertise post-PhD went into drug repurposing, high-throughput drug screens, experimental therapeutics, and I ended up for 5 years in academic healthcare doing work in cancer diagnostics, genome variant interpretation, and health services research. I am also extremely strongly interested in, and have been extremely strongly interested in for the past dozen years or so, metrics of the student and trainee experience at the graduate and postdoctoral level especially, that focus on disability, higher education, and STEM. I have visual impairment. I mentioned that at the beginning. As it turns out, I discovered in my 3rd year of my undergrad that I was actually the first person with a visual disability in my field, anywhere, which made it a very interesting kind of experience because people were like, what the hell do I do with you? They actually would say that too, what the hell do I do with you? Which is weird because you expect your authority figures to actually know, and sometimes they don't. And then you're in the position of actually having to educate them, and you're the one who's supposed to be educated by them, which makes life really interesting. So I'm actually here because I got supremely interested in understanding why me. Why was I the first when, as far as I was concerned, this was something that a lot of people could have and should have done before me. And so that's why I got interested in this. And you know, people would say to me in high school, people would say to me in post-secondary, well, why are you doing this, right? And a lot of people assumed that I was doing it to be the first blind geneticist. And I'm going to let you in on a little secret. I wasn't, and I have never done this to be the first blind geneticist. I decided at the age of 4, when I saw Charles Bonstell painting from 1944, mind you, of what Saturn might look like from the surface of Titan, and you can actually Google this painting, and it'll come in Google Images. It's a really beautiful painting. It's also tremendously scientifically wrong, but it was 1944, and we didn't know any better as a species at the time, and we what Titan's atmosphere was like, but it was such a gorgeous, and it was crisp, and it was visually obvious, and it was high contrast, and I could see it, and I fell in love with it, and I said, I want to do that thing. Not painting because I suck at art, but science. And so astronomy was actually my first love, and then I figured out that astronomy equaled computer programming, which I was okay with until I had a twit of a computer programming instructor in first year university, and then I became much less okay with it. So for all the students in the room, if you have an instructor who is not the greatest, they can turn you off a subject like no business. It's quite entertaining how fast it can actually happen. But that said, I still retain a hobby fascination with astronomy and the space sciences, and I retain a massive amount of information in my head about stuff that, technically speaking, in molecular biology, I have no business knowing. Exobiology would be a lovely field to work in, except it's so highly theoretical. So anyway, that's why I got into what I got into. What do I do now, though? Because now I told you I am an academic, but I work in a not-for-profit. I work in a service provider. And so near the end of my time in academic healthcare, by the time I'd gotten to that point, I knew quantitative biology really well. I knew informatics approaches really well. And what bugged me during time doing higher ed research was nobody was actually really thinking about how to do it quantitatively. And storytelling is really important, and narratives are really important, testimonials are really important. The problem is that policymakers don't tend to listen to those nearly as much as they want the numbers. There was a study that I did where 30 PhD students had actually responded to a survey, and a federal government policymaker said to me, well, you need a larger number, to which my response was, that's nice, except how many graduate students with disabilities do you think we have in this country? But it actually got me to thinking about getting volumes of data that way. So I started to talk to people about applying quantitative biology principles in non-biological settings, like social determinants of health, like health services outcomes. And so that's what I do now at the CNIB. I've also carried with me my extremely strong interest in the accessibility of STEM education into my role. And so I could do that as part of my research focus. And I also work on organizational culture change from the perspective of accessibility and inclusion as CNIB's Chief Accessibility Officer, which again is something that I've spent a long time sort of just doing in higher ed, and so that's been a bit of a natural transition. So that all of that to say, that is why I'm here having a conversation with you, and why the conference organizing committee was good enough to actually accept Ainsley's and my abstract when we submitted it, with huge thanks to Carolyn for suggesting that the conference existed. I should submit because, that would be a good thing. Carolyn and I met at the AAAS conference, and Carolyn, if I'm embarrassing you, please tell me, because this is all being recorded. And so Carolyn and I met at the AAAS conference when I gave a similar presentation to this one. We chatted about accessibility in STEM, figured out that we like chatting with one another, started regular chats on the phone, which I think either or both of us have managed to miss several of, but that's okay. And here I am because this was Carolyn's idea. So if you hate the session, talk to me. If you like the session, talk to Carolyn. So the other things for the students in the room, I'm actually just going to offer you a few life lessons from a really long-winded scientific career. First of all, what you start out doing isn't what you're going to be doing 5 years or 10 years down the road. I can almost guarantee it. It's also not necessarily what you're going to be doing next year. The funny thing about STEM is the following thing. We train our trainees to be so damn good at the technical side of things, and we actually forget that by the time you graduate with a master's or a PhD, you finish one postdoc, you finish a second postdoc, because these days postdocs have to be a calling, given that most postdocs are longer than a PhD, which is entertaining. You go through all of this, and then you get to a stage where, guess what? You're actually not doing that technical thing that you fell in love with in the first place. Right? I stopped being a bench researcher a long time ago, and I started supervising people doing bench research at a very young age, relatively speaking, within my career. And that was because the people I looked at as role models and mentors were well-established scientists who were very good scientific leaders and who saw my potential and nurtured it in that direction, and I let them nurture it in that direction. But then you actually get away from the technical side of things. And so I fell in love with technical stuff, but then I also fell in love with the people side of science, the management and leadership of the science, and that's where I've ended up. But it's not what I started loving when I started my university education. I'm not telling you when that was so that you can date me, because you're all going to get it wrong. The other thing is, when it comes to lessons learned, creative solution finding is key. We are in that generation of students with disabilities moving through STEM. And it's funny because, I started saying this 10 or 15 years ago, and the problem is it hasn't really changed in 10 or 15 years. We're still in that space where everyone thinks they're the first, and where conferences like this are generational opportunities, right? Like, this is a one-off conference, but really it can't end with tomorrow's closing ceremonies. It really has to continue, and that's the other reason I want all your contact information, right? Because these kinds of conversations deserve to continue. Here's what happens. You're going to have a student at a school in a program with a disability. They don't know anybody else who's a peer in their program, in their field with a disability. Their faculty don't know of anyone. Their service providers don't know of anyone. And so they hear, well, you're the first person. What they don't hear is, you're the first person I've actually heard of, or you're the first person I've worked with. They hear you're the first person. And so then they think that they're the first, and that's actually a very stressful place to be. I know, I've been there. The difference was, when I was doing my undergrad, I actually empirically looked around for other individuals. And the only other person with a visual impairment and anything to do with genetics I could find was Thomas Fisher. Thomas Fisher's the father of population genetics. He did his work in the 1920s, right? I guarantee you he wasn't around when I was training. I think he passed on by that point. And so there often tend to be no role models. And when there's no role models, you have to go fishing for solutions. And so creative solution finding is part of the work that we end up having to do, first as trainees and then as scientists. And the beauty of a conference like this is, the most powerful message that it sends is, we are not alone. Because suddenly there's a whole community of us who are all working in this space and trying to address the same challenges, and that wasn't there before. The other thing is thinking critically about process and outcomes. That's also a really important conversation, because often what ends up happening is people will fall into traps, and I know there's some service providers in the room, and I've worked with enough providers and consider them friends to know that the policies that you folks have are not built on the edge cases. They're built on the majority, and you'll see very shortly that the majority of students in postsecondary, the majority of students in the K-12 space, they're not that interested in STEM. And part of the reason they're not that interested in STEM is because they have been told they shouldn't be. They've been told that they can't be, and so they will just naturally go with the flow and go away from it. And so you can't build a policy around STEM unless you feel like you have a critical mass around it. And so sometimes you really have to think through how a policy is there and how it might actually apply to you. And then the other thing that I learned is how to work in a complex multidisciplinary team, and the importance of communication, and also trusting the strategy that team is going to have. And I've done that in a few different ways, a few different times now. And it certainly taught me a lot about sort of the machinery of team science, the machinery of team problem solving in the 21st century. This presentation is not over. Even though it says acknowledgements, this presentation is based on 3 pieces of work that have been done over the past half a decade. Creating Culture of Accessibility in the Sciences, published in Academic Press in 2016, December. A task force report that I led that came out just before that, called Understanding the Experience of Graduate Students with Disabilities in Canada. And the Accessible Science Labs project, hosted on accessiblecampus.ca, which was published in 2014. I already acknowledged and identified my primary collaborator, Ainsley Latour. I will let you in on a tiny secret. She is also now my wife. And so, we met over this stuff, and we figured out that we not only liked doing this stuff, but we also really liked each other. And then, things went on from there. So I'm going to actually chat for a few minutes about what yesterday was like. And I'm going to tell you that scientists with disabilities were, at previous times in history, not uncommon in their disciplines, and often contributed at a very high level. But today, the reason that we have conferences like SciAxis is that we find it difficult to identify scientists with disabilities in equivalent proportions or with equivalent degrees of success. Now, there's some reasons for that, and I'm going to suggest that the reasons for that have a lot to do with why postdoc is a difficult thing to do these days, and a lot of that has to do with how science evolved after World War II. There's a book on the subject you can find. Paula Stefan wrote it, and it's actually a wonderful read. And I highly, highly encourage you to take a look at this. But the moral of this particular story is that the industrialization of STEM research that occurred after World War II really shifted the way that we do things, and allowed for the creation of increased hierarchies in STEM, and increasing niche specializations as the fields were diversifying. As our rate of knowledge generation increased, the ability of any to be a path went down. And the fact of the matter was that you needed to be tremendously specialized in a tremendously specialized area in order to go somewhere. And a lot of that was one side of it. The other side, attitudes around disability, really, really shifted and mutated, if you'll allow the genetic term, over the past 70 years or so, again, almost as a consequence of the lead up to and the follow-up from World War II. And that had to do with societal perceptions around ability. There are famous fictional scientists with disabilities. Sheldon Cooper. Spock of Vulcan. How many of you are Star Trek Discovery fans? Anybody? Thank you. Thank you. Spoiler alert for everybody else who watched season 2 who really need to get into Star Trek Discovery. Spock was outed as having a learning disability. Which was actually really interesting, right? Certainly an interesting way to reflect on a 53-year-old character who is iconic. Oh, Star Trek fans generally? No? Yes? Yes? So there are a lot of historical achievements in STEM by many diverse contributors. And so the prototypical scientist of North American culture is a figment of the past 70 years. And think about what scientists have done from a diverse perspective. You think about the invention of zero, which was a Hindu thing. You think about Arab and Chinese astronomy. You think about stellar evolution and the work that was done on stellar evolution. You think about discovery of radium. You think about units of heredity. All of these things were done by individuals from diverse backgrounds. Post-World War II shifts in societal perceptions, though, were really cultural. And they led to the rise of the North American research industry and shifts in the economics of science, which have really changed how we do this. This slide actually lists a number of scientists with disabilities and their accomplishments. Thomas Fisher was the father of population genetics. He had sight loss. Henry Cavendish was a physicist who's now thought to be on the autism spectrum. He was the one who discovered hydrogen. Quantum theory, also on the spectrum. Henrietta Leavitt was a deaf astronomer who was instrumental in our understanding of stellar evolution. Thomas Edison, the guy who invented the light bulb, he had a learning disability. Albert Einstein, we all know, the guy who came up with the special and general theories of relativity, he also had a learning disability. Stephen Hawking, we all know of. He had amyotrophic lateral sclerosis and modeled cosmology. And Temple Grandin, who's speaking tomorrow, is a behaviorist also on the spectrum, right? The interesting thing about this list is there's only 2 people on that list from the latter half of the 20th century and the early part of the 21st. Most of those examples are from before that, right? The other thing I think is actually really relevant in this conversation is the issue of the false assumption of visible disabilities. We assume, all of us do this, that a disability is going to be obvious. And that is not always necessarily the case. I'm going to offer you a definition. It's my definition. You won't find it in a textbook, but I will vigorously defend a disability that becomes evident or is one that is identified when a person is using an assistive aid or device. Now, that could be a human, it could be a canine, it could be a form of service animal, or it could be a piece of technology. It could even be an iPhone. It is often situation dependent. I have a white cane. My white cane is actually underneath the registration desk in my overnight bag. Why? Because it's a big, open, clear area. I took the time to get oriented this morning when I got in. I don't need my cane here. right? I put it away. And if I hadn't told you that I have a visual impairment, since none of you are ophthalmologists or optometrists, you probably wouldn't be able to figure it out. And so for all purposes, given that I outed myself, you know, but if I hadn't outed myself, I had an invisible disability standing up in front of you right now. The interesting thing, particularly in terms of blindness, is when we think about blindness and partial sight, we think they're visible disabilities. We think that everyone's going to see, no pun intended, that this person can't see, right? That's a blindness joke. It's okay to laugh. But that's incorrect. And in fact, about 90% of people who are blind or partially sighted don't use an assistive aid that is evident. And so you actually not know unless they chose to tell you. And now that is a personal choice, as is disclosure of disability generally, dependent on many factors. And so the first lesson I want to leave you with is never assume. STEM and research don't happen in a vacuum. This is a really important point, except, by the way, when they do. And for those of you who have not seen this, there's a really cool twin study that was done on the ISS that was published in the journal Science on April 15th. So STEM and research in that particular case did happen in a vacuum. That's me making a funny again. Clearly it's falling on appreciative ears. Anyway, so students with disabilities study in post-secondary education. We've got data in the Canadian context that actually illustrates that the most likely thing is going to be social sciences. After that, it's education. After education, applied health sciences, and those are healthcare adjacent fields. Some of them see patients like occupational and massage therapy, but a lot of them don't necessarily see patients either, but healthcare adjacent fields. So applied health sciences, you will find a lot of individuals. Humanities, arts in that order, business in that order, physical sciences, including computer science and engineering, and then biological sciences is dead last, right? Applied health sciences are interesting. They're a helper profession like education and like the social services sector. And so it's not terribly surprising to me, having studied the space for the past dozen years, that students with disabilities often will gravitate toward helper professions. And that's because people from those professions made a difference to them, and so they want to try to pay, or they want to try to follow a role model who is very good. One of those is usually the reason that somebody will go into a helper profession. There are challenges with the applied health sciences fields, and they boil down to licensing and accreditation practices. They boil down to practicum and work-integrated learning placements, occupational culture, boundary issues on of the faculty who are too busy being clinicians and trying to treat their students as opposed to, mentor and coach their students. Faculty ethics, and the issue of finding a job. In the biological sciences, there's a different set of challenges. Some are related, some are not. Accessibility solutions are actually not designed for biological sciences predominantly. They are designed for the physical sciences, which is really interesting, but they're not designed for the biological sciences. Faculty attitudes are a challenge. The opportunities for research experience as an undergrad are huge challenges because people will often balk at accommodating someone in, say, an honors thesis research project where you're only hours a week, or as a summer student doing 2 or 3 months worth of work in somebody's lab. No one's going to accommodate that because they're like, well, what's gone tomorrow? And also the accessibility of labs and field work tends to be significant challenges as well. There are solutions, and the solutions that I'm proposing are what this workshop are about, and they boil down to understanding the essential requirements of the field, that universal design in training and education are absolutely important, that curriculum design is important, and that differentiated instruction are important. And I'm here to cheerfully argue with you that those sets of solutions apply both to the applied health sciences and to the biological sciences. They also apply to the physical sciences, but I'm going to actually suggest to you that there's a hidden emphasis on physical sciences within the space of accessibility in STEM. And there's a few reasons for that, and I'll give you some of those reasons and give you an example of why I think this is ongoing. First of all, we've got this issue of learning how to code in an accessible way, and there's a lot of work around accessibility of coding and robotics from an accessible perspective, and that's an engineering issue, that's a computer science issue. It's talked about heavily. Braille for math, Nemeth code, talked about heavily. Accessible equation editors, interestingly, I've done some work in the online learning space. Accessible equation editors focus very specifically on accessibility of mathematical equations. You show them a chemical equation, you show them a biochemical enzymatic equation, and they freeze solid. They don't know what to do with them, right? And so that's a bit of a challenge. And then accessible lab solutions often get concentrated in chemistry and engineering. Not even physics, but they get concentrated in chemistry and engineering. So there. The other thing, I actually did this morning. So here's actually the list of concurrent sessions for SciAccess. There's 43 concurrent sessions for SciAccess. And I counted them. The vast majority are 35% of those, so roughly 1 in 3 are disability experience, general disability conversations. About 30% of them actually focus on physical sciences topics. Another 28% are presentations where the conversation talks about STEM broadly and not a specific discipline specifically. This is actually only at the conference that even skates around the topic of biological sciences. That's not the conference organizer's challenge. That's actually a reflection, I would think, of what was submitted, right? And so what you have is, in my view, a very limited focus on the biological sciences when it comes to sessions like these, when it comes to conferences like these, and that limited focus comes out of a general limited focus within the space of people who work on that. So biological sciences are a huge problem, right? Occupational culture, as I said, was a problem, and the tension is with occupational culture, once people have figured out a way of doing something, a history and a tradition gets built up around that. And human beings, we ossify. We like to do things a certain way. As a species, we're very innovative. As individuals, we are so not innovative, it's not even funny. Right? How many of us that we don't like changing, right? How many of us take vacation the same time every year? How many of us take vacation at all? A few are willing to confess. Good, excellent, right? But so we have a way of doing things, and patients have very rigid ways of doing things, right? I mean, how long did it take the Catholic Church to apologize to Galileo, as an example? Right? 350 years? There you go. So there's tension between that occupational culture and innovation and new ways of thinking and doing, and that's a challenge that is especially relevant in the context of diversity. On this slide right now is, it's actually a PowerPoint drawn cylinder. I failed art, by the way. I failed visual art. When I took grading art, I was in Barbados, and I didn't know what snowflakes looked like, and I painted them as white blobs. Because that was what I thought they were, and I thought I could actually see them as white blobs, and boy, was I wrong when I came to Canada and figured out otherwise. So I failed art. I make no claims about the niceness of the drawings that I'm showing you. I'm just, this is what PowerPoint gives me. This represents the scientific training pipeline, the pipeline that says you start as a university undergraduate student. You push through, you may go to graduate school, you push beyond that, you may go to professional faculty or a postdoctoral training program, you push beyond that and you get a job. That's the pipeline, right? Everybody in academia talks about that pipeline as if it has one destination, and that's the faculty appointment. I think the challenge with that is that the success rates of faculty post-PhD, 5 years post-PhD, rate of a postdoc getting a faculty appointment is, I think, like 8%. It's negligible. And so I'm just talking about employment because I recognize how hard it is to get a faculty appointment. Now, for students with disabilities, what actually happens is that's not a pipeline, it's a funnel. It's a dangerously funnel. There are thick black lines with diamond tips on this slide for those who can't see. And instead of a cylinder, there's actually a triangle wide at the left and the right. Going from high school to college undergraduate education, there's a barrier, there's a transitional barrier. From undergrad to what comes next, whether it's a professional school or graduate, there's a barrier. From graduate and professional to residency, postdoctoral training, there's a barrier. From that stage to employment, barrier. So there's a number of transitional barriers. There are a number of barriers, and what ends up happening is you can pour in 100 students with disabilities, the top end of this funnel, and by the time you're done, you're lucky to get one out the other side, right? So how do we actually address that? There's three ways you can address that. The first is you pour in more students, and if you pour in more students, you get more students out the other side. You acknowledge there's an attrition rate, so the logic is more in, more out, irrespective of what that attrition rate is, as long as that attrition rate is constant. The second way of doing it, though, is to break that glass barrier, to break that glass ceiling, to destroy those transitional barriers, and to say, okay, we're actually going to widen the mouth of that funnel by widening the sides of that funnel, and saying, you know what? There are transitional barriers. There are barriers to admission to things beyond the undergrad. Let's eliminate those barriers. And the last way of doing it, fostering inclusion, which is to say we recognize that there are environmental challenges within the programs at every level of, frankly, right through to post-secondary, and so do what we can to eliminate those environmental barriers that exist and foster inclusion that way. The mathematics of inclusion are very simple. Innovation today requires intention. You have to plan to be innovative. We have to do that with intent. Inclusion leads to innovation for all sorts of good reasons that you can go look up in Forbes, so I won't dwell on them. And so what that ends up meaning is you can't just magically wave a wand and expect inclusion to happen. I work in the not-for-profit sector. There are about 90% of the employees in my organization who believe that all you have to do is your fingers and research just magically happens. Push a button and your spreadsheet is calculated for you. That is so wrong. My greatest challenge is countering that specific philosophy, but it's the same philosophy around inclusion. Inclusion just doesn't happen, right? And there's a huge difference between inclusion and inclusion, just as there's a difference between accessibility and inclusion. And so accessibility is the design of systems, policies, processes, and environments to ensure that persons with disabilities have equal access to a given space. More than technical, though, it's a conversation where we often will focus on building and space design. We'll focus on assistive devices. We'll often focus on accessible formats. When we think about accessible science labs, we're going to think about Braille. We're going to think about large print. We're going to think about JAWS and Zoom Tech, other forms of assistive aids. We're going to think about talking LabQuest. We're going to think about the lab benches and how they're designed, and a fume hood and what height it's at, and the sink and whether the faucets have paddles on them or knobs, right? That's not all it needs to be. There are multiple additional forms of accessibility barrier that we need to be confronting. Attitude, one. Financial for a second. Communication for a third. Environmental for a fourth. And the list goes on. Accessibility is a moving target. It's a pace of change problem. Building codes change in the time span of decades, but technology changes in the time span of months and years. This is an iPhone 6 Plus. I bought it 5 years and 4 months ago. It is so out of me. I haven't upgraded it yet because, I'm lazy and it still works, but it is so out of date, it's not even funny. It's also so slow, and it's a battery hog, and right now it's sitting at, let's see, 79%. That's not bad. Usually if I were using that thing, it'd be down to 30%, and I finished charging it at 8 o'clock this morning. What's accessible today likely won't be accessible tomorrow. And our conversations around accessibility always require a process of continuous reevaluation. And that speaks to pedagogy as much as it speaks to anything else. Accessibility is a way of thought. It's learned, but ultimately instinctive behavior. It's like breathing. The ideal is unconscious applications of ANI as educators, because for the past 21 years I've been a researcher and educator. As educators, I will say that what we need to do is get that space where we're interacting with our students, we're interacting with our trainees on that one-on-one basis, where we're able to recognize what their strengths are, what their limitations are, and work with them in that kind of context. It's easy to do that in a research lab setting. It's a lot harder to do that in a classroom. And it's even harder to do it in a presentation format like this one, where I'm kind of talking at you more than talking with you right now. To get there, we have to learn a set of new behaviors and unlearn a set of old or bad behaviors. Accessibility is more than response to statement of need, and that's the other thing I think is really important. It's a movement toward environmental solutions, and in the context of education, that means we've got to be flexible, we've got to be creative, and we've got to have the ability to problem solve things before they actually become problems. Right? Now, whether we're problem solving buildings or policies or processes or practices or service environments or lecture notes or teaching styles, we're still problem solving, and we have to problem solve in the design stage. This is different from inclusion. Inclusion is fostering a sense of belonging, engagement, and empowerment among all persons, regardless of ability within a given space. And I argue with you that accessibility and inclusion together are really what we're talking about. The culture of ANI in STEM is recognizes that systems, policies, and processes by themselves are not enough to foster ANI. Saying we must let in, 5% of our students, from the disability sector is not enough to just say, okay, now we have an accessible and inclusive space, right? Accessibility and inclusion ought to be shared community values. We ought to recognize what they bring to the table. They ought to be shared community experiences. And that act of sharing and the act of personal responsibility that goes with it actually builds that culture. So what we want to do in STEM education is move away from reactive accessibility toward proactive. We want to move toward environmental solutions and away from asking for help. We want to move toward universal design and away from individual accommodations, and that really gets at the value of and the role of self-advocacy. In STEM, there's a pile of foundations of accessibility, and this is a linked Venn diagram. And the foundations that I'm going to identify to you are physical, technology and learning modes, accessible content delivery, learning skills, supervision and mentorship, attitudes, gatekeeping, and we'll talk about that in a moment, policy and practice, and learning styles. We also have to balance the STEM trainee experience. The issue of formal learning versus informal learning, right? There's one person who does informal astronomy education in the room. There's a lot of informal learning that goes on in STEM, and I'm going to start there because we informally learn by mentorship, by sponsorship, by delegated supervision, by the opportunity as a graduate student to teach a summer student, by the opportunity as a summer student to teach, a younger summer student, through collaborations, through professional networks. We formally learn, of course, through through being supervised by a faculty member or a mentor, through the work that we do in a lab, in field work, in a clinical rotation, or in a practicum, through academic assessments, and through classroom learning. We all know this. I don't think I need to dwell on this, but the barriers that are faced by students with disabilities in the sciences are legion. There's negative attitudes of educators, caregivers, parents, and other professionals. There's barriers from the regulatory colleges. There's a lack of appropriate accommodations, lack of appropriate self-advocacy skills, a lack of available accessible class format materials, limited exposure to role models and mentors in STEM disciplines, and a lack of knowledge on the part of educators and student services professionals on how to work within this space. Because like I said, the majority of students don't go into STEM. They go into something else. And accommodating a student in social science, like actually say a classroom, is very, very accommodating a student in botany, right? Those are not the same thing. And can't necessarily be treated as if they were. And so some of the challenges that we face in STEM are the use of technology over our flexibility in teaching, how we represent visual concepts, this issue of discipline-specific symbology, and the example again is a math equation is not a chemistry equation, it's not a biochemical equation, and how we tend to do default modes of teaching in STEM. Right? I have 90 minutes to talk to you and to give you information and to get you engaged in this. And a lot of that is me talking. There's going to be time for you talking as well, and the more of that, the better, right? But this is not teaching style. My default teaching style is to get you to learn this on your own while I facilitate that, right? And so there is how we teach versus how we present, and then there's the issue of student engagement. Now I'm going to give you an example of technology over pedagogy, right? And think about three things, and I put three things up here: the Doppler effect, the concept of flight, and an animal dissection, right? And there are ways that technology will solve these challenges for students with disabilities, right? But then there's also ways of thinking about these things. So can you teach a Doppler effect to a student who is deaf without referencing an ambulance? How? Okay, very good. So you would show them spectra, right? But then would they not know something else associated with that?
You can also use formula parts.
Yep, that's right. So for people who are more attuned to mathematical ways of learning, you can show them the formula for the Doppler effect. For people who are attuned to more visual ways and have the capability of learning visually, then actually, for example, the Doppler galaxies receding, like the red shift of galaxies and the blue shift of the Andromeda galaxy. That's a good way of teaching them, right? So there's different ways of actually demonstrating that. But if you start with the principle of the Doppler effect is the ambulance receding and coming towards you, or the train receding and coming towards you, a student who's deaf is not going to be able to pick that up. So right there is thinking about the problem from a pedagogy approach to get at a different way of actually teaching it. How do you teach flight to somebody who's not seen a bird or an airplane? Yeah, and how do you demonstrate the lifting body effect? So you're right. You would start with the tactile, representation of a wing. How would you do the other part of it? A grade 5 science teacher that I was talking to about this suggested, getting the students to make paper airplanes in different shapes, which is a good way of doing it. And so again, how do you think about the concept if you take away one of our senses? Dissection's an interesting one. I was actually in a conference with a bunch of teachers of the visually impaired when I raised this, and I said, well, how would you do it? Somebody said, well, if it's a frog, you print the frog. And at which point I suggested that hashtag print the frog could be a useful Twitter handle session. I don't know if anyone, free, by the way, print the frog. Here's the problem though. What's the difference between a dissection and an assembly? Yeah, so can you learn exactly the same thing by building a frog versus taking the frog apart? Exactly, right? So what are some other ways of dealing with the issue of dissection if you've got somebody with motor coordination difficulties, whether that's physical or whether that's sight?
Help them out by doing all the cutting and learn skills or organs
Yep.
and stuff like that,
Yep.
so they can actually recognize
Yep.
what.
That's right. Because the act of cutting is not what we call the essential requirement, right? Students are asked to do the dissections in groups, usually in classes, because there's not enough frogs to go around, or fetal pigs, or rats, or earthworms, or whatever. My grade 10 earthworm died faster. I am so sorry for the poor earthworm. It was just not. The thing is that the students are asked to do these things. My grade 10 science teacher said, take the earthworm home with you and dissect it on your kitchen table. Oh, that was a horrible experience. Traumatic, very, very traumatic. I'm in biology. At that point, I actually wanted to be in astronomy still. And so I didn't think of dissection exercise, and it was why I was like, ew, biology is squishy, and quoting Sheldon Cooper. So little known fact about me, by the way, I was 10 when I started high school. And so the Sheldon Cooper thing is only slightly a joke. My bosses call me Sheldon every so often. It's embarrassing. But yeah, so with a dissection, you don't actually have to do the dissection in order to understand what's underneath, right? And so if the dissection has been done, recognizing that the object is to learn animal physiology, not to learn, how to be a vet, right? Then you actually think about what you're actually trying to teach the student. You may. Name, please. Well, that's so thing, right? Like, why do you need only 5 minutes to figure out what the liver is? Yeah. So if it were a timed activity, why do you need only 5 minutes to figure out where the liver is? Aha. Now let me ask you another question. Do you know why exams are timed? To keep you moving, sure, yes. Why else? There's only 24 hours in the day. So what does that actually mean, though? Yeah, somebody's watching you while doing that test, right? There's a proctor, there's a teacher, or there's somebody there making sure that you don't cheat, right? So there's pay, and there's availability of rooms, and there's cleaning staff, and there's 24 hours in the day, right? Exams are as long as they are, or as short as they are, not because that's an essential requirement of the field 99% of the time, but it's actually because of logistics. So let's say you want to write the MCAT. MCAT these days is a computerized exam. You can take 8 hours to do it, right? There's multiple parts to it. Each part's 2 hours long, plus a couple of breaks in between. So if you do time and a half on MCAT, that's a 2-day exam because the testing's from 9 until 5, right? So they'll break it up over 2 days. Or they should, because that would be the reasonable thing to do, recognizing that there is actually no need for the biological sciences section on the MCAT to be only 2 hours long, right? The challenge ends up being that you have to convince people of that, right? Because often what will end up happening, and this is the challenge with the licensing bodies all the time, the licensing bodies will say, well, the licensing exam is what it needs to be, because if it's not that, we don't know if these people can work at speed in the field. The problem is that that's cheating, because working at speed in the field is often not a requirement unless that's a part of the job. And when it's a part of the job, sure, go ahead and test for it. But if you're writing a licensing social work, or you're writing a licensing exam for genetic diagnostics, or you're writing an exam for occupational therapy, often that timing is not a part of the job, right? And you're allowed that flexibility in the work environment, you're just not allowed that flexibility in the exams. So that's an interesting thing. That gets this thing called the gatekeeper function. And the gatekeeper function is this attitude that some educators will have, and I don't think any educator in the room has this, because if you had it, you probably would not be in the room. And the idea is, I don't think you can do this, therefore you shouldn't be here. And I don't think you can do this because I'm actually not sure how to help you do this, but I can't tell you that, so I'm just going to tell you not to be here, right? Has anyone experienced that? To anyone who was surprised by the amount of clapping, that's right, it is disturbing. Because that's not an attitude that an educator or a service provider should have with a student. That's not why we go to school. It's not why we learn. But it's a perspective that's there. And the idea ends up being, well, you're not fit to do this. You can't actually get a job in this field, therefore, right? I've experienced this in post-secondary. I didn't experience it in high school. I had some really good grade 9 through science teachers, but in post-secondary, I experienced it a few times because people were like, well, you're blind, you can't do science. And to which my response was, here's my transcript, you want to bet? When I started TAing in my master's, it was, what was I doing? I was doing drug receptor interactions, Michaelis-Menten kinetics, dirty math, and like chemistry stuff. The prof that wanted to be a TA for, he gave me a phone interview. Now, my master's supervisor would be frankly, actually told him that I was blind. And in 1998, when I started my master's, whoops, I just partially gave away my age. So when I started my sort of like, that's okay, but today you can't do that. That's called discrimination. And it should be called discrimination because my master's supervisor actually overstepped. She should not have. So the guy on the phone said to me, I hear you're blind. I said, okay. He said, well, how can you see to teach? I was a cheeky 19-year-old when I started my master's. I said, do you want to hire me and we'll find out? I had 0 teaching experience, by the way, but I thought it was a stupid question. And I've never been shy of saying it's a question, so I told him it was a stupid question. I got the job, and I proved to him that it was a stupid question. So culture of A&I in STEM is more than just physical, right? We tend to talk about physical, we tend to talk about technological, but it's so much more than that. And it's really an open and inclusive environment within science education and training that fosters a holistic dialogue around accessibility, universal design, and accommodation. And so I'm going to throw an axiom on the floor here and suggest that a fully accessible learning experience in STEM owes as much to pedagogy and teaching approach as it does to technology and the platform supporting it. We're going to talk about essential requirements for a couple of minutes. We've alluded to this previously. Essential requirements, it's a legal term. Essential requirements of a course or program refer to the knowledge and skills that must be acquired or demonstrated in order for students to meet the learning objectives of that course or program. It's defined by two things. The first thing is a skill that has to be demonstrated in order to meet the objectives of a course. And the second thing, it's got to be demonstrated in a specific way. It's extremely important to not confound the evaluation method with the actual competency. And the example that I give is if a student must understand how to design, interpret, analyze, and try a scientific experiment, and dissection is a good example of this, right? If you understand and interpret the placement of the organs and blood vessels inside an animal, does that actually mean you have to cut the animal? And you, sir, said the answer is no. And you're entirely correct, right? The answer is absolutely no. If the essential requirement were do surgery, then the answer would be yes, but that's a very different thing than understand the placement of the organs inside the frog. The essential requirements for education are broadly broken out into like three or four specific areas. The first is essential requirements, which are applicable across all disciplines. And these are things like soft skills, presentation skills, working with groups, things like that. Discipline-specific essential requirements that are unique to genetics, that are unique to astronomy, that are unique to chemistry. And then there are technical essential requirements that are unique to that thing that you're specifically doing. And so the problem is how we define essential requirements is not a universal thing. OSU has a different set of learning objectives for its first-year biology course than does the University of Toronto. And I'm probably willing to bet you that the OSU have slightly different definitions of learning objectives for that same course, right? Which, if you think about it, is a problem, right? Because if you're in Cincinnati at OSU versus Columbus at OSU, then you're going to learn slightly different things. And should education be like that? The problem ends up being intellectual freedom, and the fact that as educators we want intellectual freedom, which means we want the ability to tweak the course to our satisfaction so that we'll actually be convinced to do it, because most of us don't want to teach those courses. That's also a little known fact. I'm sorry if I just gave it out. And the other thing is it speaks to this notion of the hidden curriculum in post-secondary education. 25 years ago, post-secondary education was all about the learning and the getting out and the doing stuff. And then there started to be a sea change in the late 1990s into the early 2000s where we started to talk more about the student experience. And so the hidden curriculum in post-secondary is all the things we want and expect the students to know or learn without formally teaching them, and calling these things out. So we don't often call them out either orally or in writing, but we expect students to absorb them. And these are often drivers of success in the field. And you think about the professional networks that you build during your education, and that's one of the hidden curriculum pieces of post-secondary. And so for students with disabilities, we don't often know what we don't know, and we don't know what we're not aware we need to know. And so it does need to be called out in some really overt ways. Now, for everybody in the room, whether an educator or a student or a service provider, how do you actually find out what the essential requirement is? You ask what is being tested. You ask how is that test being done? What is the nature of the task? You ask, does it have to be done in the way that it has been defined? And then you pretend you're a 5-year-old and you say, why? And if you're not happy with the answer, you say, why again? And then again, and then again. In manufacturing and process improvements, the lean principles, any of you who've heard of those, there's the rule of 5 whys. If you ask the question why 5 times, you're likely to get to the root cause of the answer. If you get to the answer that says just because, or I said so, or that was the way I was taught, then that's the wrong answer, and that's really not an essential requirement. Will performing this task in an alternative manner, this is the money question, will performing this task in an alternative manner ultimately interfere with the student's successful performance in the discipline, program, or course? That question, if the answer is yes, then you need to understand why. But if the answer is no, then there's no reason why a student with a disability can't get this done another way and still have it count. So if you're thinking about how to discuss essential requirements, there's a few different ways to do this. But ultimately, it boils down to you need to understand what they are. You need to ensure that those requirements pass the test that we just talked about. You need to identify any areas of concern that you as a student or you as a faculty member or you as a service provider may have that have to do with accessibility and functional impact. You need to identify what the solutions to those accessibility needs are going to be, figure out a process of evaluation, figure out how to review whether your accommodations are working on a regular basis, and then go ahead and do that and keep doing it until the course is done. And now for a PhD program, what that ends up meaning is when you start out with a set of accommodations on day 1, those accommodations are not going to be the same on day 1500 in, right? My PhD level accommodations flipped halfway through the program because I got away from the mouse model and started to do more genomics work. And so I needed to go from microscope to computational. And so my visual disability had not really changed, but my project had evolved to the point where the first round of accommodations that I had were no longer applicable. And so I had to reinvent all the accommodations at a time when nobody was interested in inventing anything. And that's the exercise that you have to go through. The other side of this equation has to do with universal design for learning, differentiated instruction, inclusive teaching practice. Universal design is geared toward creating barrier-free environments for everyone, and consequently is often promoted as a panacea for the challenges of individual accommodations. It's intended to ensure that environments and products, in this case learning environments, are usable by all people to the greatest extent possible without for adaptation or specialized design, right? There are tensions here, and in higher education, the tension is often that universal design is one size fits all. That's how people read it, as opposed to an acknowledgement of the individualized experiences. And so that's really there's a difference between sort of that individualized experience and personalized intervention, how those two things play off each other in the context of the thought process around universal design. There are tensions between advocating for the student and gatekeeping on the part of the educator and the service provider. There are tensions between reactive methods and proactive methods. Lowering standards versus maintaining academic rigor. Maintaining academic rigor is a fun buzzword for saying, I'm not really sure I want to change what I'm doing. But it's hauled out every so often. And the argument does tend to go, well, aren't we lowering standards by doing things according to universal design? My response is, think about a garden. Mowing the lawn, you're applying Miracle Grow to get the grass to the same height. And so universal design is Miracle Grow, it's not a lawnmower. It's also the tension between what we tend to do is ask for the disability diagnosis. The problem is the disability diagnosis in the context of the field is not enough information to judge the functional impact, and yet we try to do it anyway as a collective. And it often doesn't work because the right people aren't at the table having the conversation. And often also the tension is equality of access versus equal opportunity for success. And what are we actually talking about is equal opportunity for success, not the equality of access piece. So in the context of STEM, it says graduate education, but it also works for STEM. Really what we need to do is understand the perspectives of students with disabilities in STEM regarding the factors that contribute to their success. We did that through a series of research projects, and we really then also looked at what faculty and service providers thought about this as well. And so when we actually started thinking about how to figure out principles of universal design in the context of STEM and in the context of graduate training, we really were looking at it from a 360-degree perspective. So there's three models that I'm going to just briefly tell you about. The physical universal design model, which speaks to equity and equality of use. The learning UD model, speaking to equity and equality of engagement. And the cultural UD model, which speaks to equity and equality of personal interaction. The physical UD model, you guys probably all know. It speaks to equitable use, flexibility in use, simple and intuitive, with perceptible information, tolerance for error, requiring low physical effort, and having size and space for the approach and use. These are the ones that were published in 1991 by the Center for Universal Design here in the US. So these are very familiar to folks. Universal design for learning and universal design of instruction are two sort of related models. UDL is focused on ways of displaying knowledge and skill acquisition, while UDI is described as an approach to course design that seeks to create an appropriate learning environment for all students, including those with disabilities. The UDL model focuses on three things: multiple means of representation of information, multiple means of expression of information, and multiple means of engagement with information. So giving learners of acquiring information and knowledge, providing learners alternatives to demonstrate what they know, and tapping into learners' interests and offering appropriate challenges to increase motivation. The last one is the social inclusion one, the universal design in the context of cultural interactions. This is one that came out of work that we did around the projects that I was telling you about. And it really speaks to equity and equality of personal interaction, student with educator, student with supervisor, student with service provider with educator, service provider with supervisor, and so on. And it really speaks to academic and social integration, and it requires a recognition that things change over time, requires a recognition everyone working together is super important, and requires a recognition that the whole purpose of accessibility isn't to undermine essential requirements, but instead it's an opportunity to the student to succeed within their space. And so it speaks to flexibility, it speaks to dynamism, it speaks to creativity, it speaks to collaboration and engagement, fostering positive relationships, and involves interactions that don't contravene the academic rigor and are respectful of the social identity of the student. Many students with disabilities live with a disability, may live with more than one disability, but will also live with who they are as people. I'm a first-generation immigrant to North America. I was born in the Caribbean. I'm a Canadian citizen, but I'm not a born Canadian citizen, right? I'm of South Asian extraction. I'm male. I'm blind. Here's the problem. When people look at me, they see blind first and everything else second. In fact, they see blind first to the exclusion of everything else, and that's the challenge, because when we have these conversations, we need to respect who the student is. We also need to respect who the faculty member is. We've had a few, there's been a few cases in Canada that have gone to legal challenge where a faculty member from a diverse background with a disability and a student with a disability have come into conflict because the access requirements for one and the access requirements for the other are not the same. And so those are interesting tensions and things to try to work out, but we're so new into this space, we don't have precedent. We barely know how to have the conversation. Frameworks for inclusive education really speak to UDL, really speak to differentiated instruction and individualized accommodation. And inclusive teaching practices refer to any of approaches to address the needs of students with a variety of backgrounds and learning styles and abilities. And these strategies of learning environment and really valued. Inclusive teaching practice speaks to inclusion as a process to respond to diversity. It makes that hidden curriculum I was telling you about before explicit. It uses defined essential requirements and uses differentiated instruction, which is effectively data gathering in the course of teaching as a way to inform and modify instructions for groups of students as the course progresses. And it also enables full participation and enhances the quality of the student experience. When we talk about data gathering, we're going to talk about assessments. We talk about assessments for learning. We talk about assessments as learning and assessments. And so we can provide assessments as a way for the student to learn. We can provide assessments in order to understand what the student needs to learn, and we can provide assessments in order to judge how well the student has learned. We can do formative assessments, we can do in-progress assessments, and we can do summative assessments at the very end that tell us the cumulative story of what's gone on during the course. All of this requires timely feedback to students. And in the online learning context, in the context of a classroom of 150 students, it's very difficult to imagine how to do this with students because you're doing it one-on-one or you're doing it with groups. But it's still possible, right? And what it takes is for the educator to recognize that one of the things we do as educators is to read the audience and to read the people who are interacting with us, right? And as an educator with a disability, I've got different unique ways of doing that compared to other educators. But the whole point is we're here to read you. We're here to interact with you. This is why I tell jokes. Whether you laugh at them or not, it gives me a sense as to whether or not you're engaging with me. If you don't laugh, then I know that you're bored to tears and you don't want to leave, right? As someone just did because I heard the door. Right? Right? You're laughing now, which means that you're engaging with me. And that means that I'm holding your attention for a little bit, not because you have to be here, but because you want to be here. And that tells me something about you. And so that's an example of the cues that I'm using to read you and get a sense as to how I'm interacting with you. And that's the point of differentiated instruction. I'm at you, I'm talking with you, I'm talking to you, right? I'm having a dialogue, even though it sounds like a soliloquy from Hamlet. Thank you for laughing at that. That was my best joke. So when we think about I throw this up here because there's a lot of distance ed that goes on in K to 12 and in post-secondary today. This gets tricky, but it's still doable through assessments and assignments, through course discussion boards, and through direct communication with the student. And really what we need to do is we need to recognize that when we put the inclusive teaching practice together with the universal design for learning, with the differentiated instruction, with the physical universal design model, and with the cultural universal design model, in the interface of all of those is really where we're getting at that accessibility in the training environment and the inclusion in the training environment for students with disabilities. So in STEM learning and design second, we want a clear definition of essential requirements and learning objectives and required skills for the course. We want built-in flexibility timelines, and we want to know as much as possible whether we can have the material in advance. We want multiple means of representation of course key concepts, of course materials, approaches, and styles. We want multiple ways to think about assessment methods, assessment times, and assessment uses, right? So putting it all together then, what we want the students to learn is the first question we have to answer when it comes to accessible pedagogy in STEM. Understand what we want the students to learn. Understand all of what we want the students to learn. Understand that we need to look at multiple means of representation, engagement, and expression and assessment. Understand that how we teach, the accessibility of our teaching method is not the same as the accessibility of our teaching content, right? And also there is a chemical formula on the bottom here that goes inclusive teaching practice equals essential requirements plus UDL plus differentiated instruction plus individualized accommodation. There's a thought frame that I've also put up here for educators and service providers in thinking through how to work with students with disabilities. And it really comes down to a step. I'm going to ask questions in order to understand what the real scenario is, because what I am experiencing with, Caroline, for example, may not be what I experience with Mahadeo. And what I experience with Mahadeo may be what I experience with, I don't know, right? And so understanding the specific needs of the student, the specific functional impacts of the student, it comes down to that data gathering piece. We understand the holistic nature of what the student is, who they are, what they need, how they're learning, and then we can use that to teach them more effectively. The foundational metaphor behind all of this is one that you folks have probably seen a few times. It's a cute little cartoon. We've got three boys. Let's call them Alvin, Simon, and Theodore. And originally, they're going to watch a neighborhood ball game. Alvin's the tallest. He's the only one who can see over a fence. Someone comes along and says, all right, fine. All of you guys, you need help to see the ball game. I'm going to give you 3 boxes. But, you're going to fight over the boxes, so each of you is going to get a box. And everyone gets a box. On the left side of this image, you can see that Alvin, frankly, doesn't need the box. When he stands on the box, the fence comes up to his waist. He's not interested in the box, but he's got it anyway because otherwise he'll pick a fight. Simon's got a box, peeks over the fence, and that's nice. Theodore got a box, but he's too short, right? His head can't get over the fence. He's too young, or he's a person, right? So he can't see that high. And then they figure it out. They're like, hang on a second. Alvin says, I don't need the box. I'm going to give it to Theodore. Theodore now has 2 boxes. I don't have any. All our heads at the same height. We can peek over the fence. We can all watch the ball game. And that works. That's the difference between equal access and equal opportunity, right? But then someone really smart comes along and says, what's the purpose of the fence in this ball game? And for the most part, the fence in this ball game is, sure, it's protection of the crowd, but that doesn't always work. We know that. But the purpose of the fence is that's the home run marker, right? Beyond that fence, you've got a home run. So does it matter whether it's or a chain link fence or a line in the grass? Let's replace the fence with something else that serves the same purpose but enables the boys to see the game. And that's universal design, right? And that's what we strive for in this entire conversation. Again, the sources, the graduate experience report I told you about, published in 2016. If you're going to look at creating a culture of accessibility in the sciences, the book's actually in my duffel bag underneath the registration desk. I can show it to anyone who wants afterward. Chapter 1 is the general conversation around accessibility in STEM. Chapter 7 to 9 talks about mental health and peer support. Chapter 14 talks about the student-supervisor relationship. Chapter 25 about universal design in STEM. The majority of this actually draws on Chapter 12, which is the conversation around differentiated instruction and inclusive teaching practice. And so that's where you go for the information. There's a link to the book on the slide and a repeat of my contact information. And I'm going to leave that up there because that's the last slide that's actually worth anything. So I can actually 20 minutes with discussion and commentary and questions, unless Savannah's going to cut me off. Okay, so.
Hold on, I'm coming. It says it's on. We'll find out.
How can this work in the field of STEAM instead? It's STEM, but it's inclusive to the arts.
That's a really good question. I'm getting to get turned off. Thank you, Susan. So a lot of this applies in the context of STEAM. There's a few different ways to actually define things, not just science, technology, engineering, and math. In Australia, they do STEM squared. The M actually it's STEMM, so science, technology, engineering, math, and medicine. I like STHEM, which is science, technology, healthcare, engineering, and math. Put it all together and say science, technology, healthcare, engineering, arts, and math if you want. I don't really have a problem. So how does it work in that context? It works by recognizing that in the arts, there are learning environments that are themselves practical in nature, that are analogous to a scientific laboratory. And if you actually go on accessiblecampus.ca, an addendum to that Accessible Science Labs project is a piece that the Vice Provost of OCAD University, Ontario College of Art and Design, they asked us to do that work very specifically because they're like, well, this is great for the sciences. What about the arts? It was a fantastic question. It's like I planted it. Thank you very much. So we think about practical space arts. We think about the concepts that we learn in the arts by analogy to how we learn them in the sciences. And we recognize that there are concepts and there are spaces that we're going to work in that are analogous to scientific laboratories or analogous to the kinds of concepts that we typically meet. There's a lot of visual representation in visual art. And so thinking about the essential requirements of what we want the students to learn in that space, it's the same kind of argument as we've gone through for STEM, right? And so you can translate every word of what I told you and replace STEM with, frankly, any discipline. Okay? You are welcome. What's your name, sir? Caleb, nice to meet you. Okay, who's next? Hang on.
Hi. I work for a local science center, and I was wondering if you had some examples of other science museums, cultural institutions that would be a really good model for us who are learning how to do more universal design and whatnot.
I wish I did. You want to work together on findings? Yes. Come see me afterward.
Okay. From San Jose State University. I teach, I use 3D printing to teach astronomy to students with visual. So this is something I just wasn't sure if you were aware of, but even if you are, the audience might not be aware of this, but the NIH has a 3D print exchange archive where they have tons and tons and tons of anatomical models and everything from actual DNA scans to actual CT scans of real people with real illnesses. and real diseases, and you can just go down, and it's all free, it's all online, and you can go and you can down through various animals and organs and all kinds of stuff, diseased, undiseased, and it's all freely accessible. I haven't done too much myself because I'm more of a physics and astronomy person, but it looks like an absolutely amazing resource that, you know, I just wanted to share with other people in the room.
I'm going to ask you to send me the link to that if you don't mind. So one of the interesting things about 3D printing, 2 years ago, the National Federation of the Blind hosted a STEM summer camp for kids who were blind, grades 9 to 12 in Maryland at Towson University, and I was one of the instructors. And my brother, who's in IT and who's got a very conveniently placed 3D printer at his school, and I were trying to mess around and figure out if we could actually do a 3D printed DNA molecule. And it was bloody difficult at that point in time to get something that had the right resolution. Because one of the interesting things about going from a visual representation to a tactile representation is how you maintain the resolution. And so there's a few different ways to do this. The Lighthouse for the Blind in San Francisco will do like tactile and charts and use puff paint to do representation of more complex images. And you've got 3D printing. But then the question ends up being whether you can scale that with sufficient resolution to maintain what you're actually trying to do, right? The biggest problem that we had when we were actually printing the 3D printing the DNA molecules, and I didn't know about the NIH database at that point in time, and it may not have been mature enough, was the resolution of the nucleotides themselves. And so we couldn't get something that had sort of the right tactile shape. Because how many of you read the double helix? Only one? Wow, go. First of all, James Watson, he is so bloody arrogant, it's not even funny. I actually listened to him once, and it's phenomenal. I never, ever, ever thought it could be that opinionated and that, shall we say, anti-disability. It was impressive. And yes, that too. And he's a thief. A misogynistic thief. So here's the fun thing about how they discovered the structure of DNA. They're messing around with a model that was very tactile, right? Rosalind Franklin's X-ray crystal structure could only be solved in one way that made sense, and it was a tactile way, right? And there was only one tactile solution that actually worked based on the crystal structure, right? And so I actually had this thought, and Ainsley and I were trying to figure out how to do this, and we were trying to work with my brother to find the right kind of DNA molecule to make it work. What we were thinking was, well, we could actually get students to replicate that experiment, right? And worked based on the data because that was a tactile exercise, right? And the challenge was that we, at that point in time, get a DNA molecule with the right resolution. Now, that's going to change over time, right? Tactile line drawings and graphs and things using puff paint are a little bit more difficult because that kind of technology, again, has a resolution problem. So if you took, for example, an immunohistochemical image of tumor versus normal, and you tried to replicate that using puff paint, you're going to lose the nuance, right? And so some things are not easily scalable, and that's where we run into some of the. But it's great to know about the advantage.
So I was just going to give a real quick follow-up about that. So if you want to do 3D print, probably the 3D printer you might have used was one of these FDM printers where it lays the plastic down layer by melting it. But these liquid resin DLP printers can do 1 to 3 orders of magnitude higher resolution. The other way you could do it that I've been looking into is augmented reality with haptic feedback gloves, where you can control whatever you want the resolution to be, and you just put these gloves on, and they give you the sensation down to almost I guess what you can basically program it to be whatever you want.
Really interesting work that's going around in terms of, that's my timer telling me it's 90 minutes, but that's okay. So there's some interesting work that's also going on around wayfinding in the context of haptics. There's a few research groups that I know of who are actually looking to do high resolution indoor navigation with haptics. And I raise that because I want to talk for 30 seconds about how we represent data. We often represent data visually because guess what? 90 some odd % of us have fully functioning eyes, and who cares about the ones who don't? Except I care about the ones who don't because I'm one of them. And so it's actually interesting to see, quote unquote, blind joke again, other forms of data representation that are out there. And you can actually represent graphical information as sound. Right? There's some folks at IBM and SAS who've been doing that. You can represent, with the right degree of resolution, graphical information, something that's visual by nature, as something that ends up being tactile and three-dimensional. Those are the two most common ways of doing it, right? Because tactile and hearing need to consider how you would do it, right? You wouldn't necessarily consider how you would do it by smell or by taste. But the other thing to keep in mind is that humans actually have a suite of 14 senses, right? We are accustomed to talking about 5 of them: sight, smell, hearing, touch, and taste. But there's 9 others underneath that that have to do with magnetic fields, that have to do with temperature, that have to do with pain and other kinds of feedback mechanisms. Not that we'd want to represent a graph as pain, because I'm sure it's already painful to a number of individuals. But we ought to think about how else we can actually show things off, right? Because it doesn't just have to be. Other comments, questions? I know I stand between you and the stampede for food, which is a dangerous place to be.
I just had a question. How do we allow people who are less aware or informed about disabilities or accessibility in the education spectrum? Because I have found that some people are just completely unaware of what people face day to day. How can we educate them about that? How do we have those conversations?
Relationship is not the best way to do it. And that's tricky because those people who are not aware are often not interested because they're like, this has nothing to do with me. It's actually really funny because I had an undergrad prof who was very, very good to me in third year. So bit of a history lesson. I discovered, like I said, in first year, the computer science was going to get along because the guy who was trying to teach me C++ was an ass. Wow, that went on video. Okay. Now he might find out what I really think about him. So teach. He could not teach, right? English was his first language, but it did not matter. He was not a good educator. And there's a lot of people in secondary, no offense, who are not good educators. And so I actually leapt from astrophysics to molecular biology in second year. So in third year, a course that I really should have taken in second year. And the prof who was the course coordinator was actually very, very good to me. And it was because she said to me one day, I gained a new people with disabilities generally go through because I last year broke my leg really badly and couldn't get around effectively for 6 months. And okay, I'm blind. I've broken toes. I've never broken my leg. If I were a militant disability activist, I would consider what she just said to me to be horribly insensitive. But it put her in the mindset where she was actually willing to consider how difficult it would be for somebody else, right? And so, I mean, the really crass answer to your question, I'm sorry, your name? Heather. The really crass answer to your question, Heather, is break their legs or poke out their eyeballs. But that too went on video. This is not good. I'm not around from these parts, so maybe it'll be okay. But in reality, you see, here's the thing, right? In Canada, 22.6% of the Canadian population, so roughly 1 in every 4.5, lives with some form of disability. The United States stats I'm not familiar with, but I can't imagine they're that different. But here's what that means. That means that somebody knows within their first degree network, whether it's a family member or a friend, they know somebody else who may live with a disability, right? And so that means they have an instant first degree relationship that if you understood what it was, you could tap into it. And then when they think about it in terms of Jacqueline or Crystal or Michael or Peter or Rob, they'll suddenly get it, right? Because they're like, oh, this isn't about a faceless student who's coming to me to say, they're blind and they need accommodations. This is about so-and-so's friend or so-and-so's child, or my brother. And then it becomes personal, and then they start to listen a lot more. You're welcome, Heather.
Question, comment, or whatever. I look at, by the way, Ferdinand, I work for Ohio State, and yeah, I'm talking as an educator, as a father of two young men with autism spectrum and facing disabilities. And my biggest challenge is when you were talking about solutions for underrepresentation, particularly the path from education to the workplace. Because we're making a lot of progress in education, we're making education more inclusive, and we're giving more people more opportunities, but unfortunately that is not translating in more opportunities in the workplace because the level of underemployment and unemployment for people with disabilities is staggering. And you talk about the need to break the ceiling. And when you talk about the statistic about so many people knowing somebody with disabilities and then still realizing that on the workplace that's not even the case, is the word accommodation creating a barrier for people?
To tell you guys a story. This is what happened when a major healthcare provider that I worked for in Toronto discovered I had a disability. Safety, I became a permanent employee, and I said, look, while, but I've lived off of my postdoc accommodation, were lived off of my grad school accommodations, and now I can't do that anymore. Can we have a chat about how to get me accommodated as a person with a visual impairment who works here? The nurse at the front desk went to talk to her supervisor through an open office door. The supervisor said at the top of her lungs, tell him to go away. I don't know how to help him just yet. I heard her. That was interesting. I went away. I came back. She said, I'm going to put you in touch with our ergonomist. What you need is documentation from your eye doctor. I was like, that's easy, that's fine. Got it, done. And she said, I'll put you in touch with our ergonomist. I said, why the ergonomist? She said, everyone goes to see the ergonomist first. I said, all right. Met the ergonomist. Ergonomist's name was Peter. In those days, I had a 76 square foot office. It was like a box. 2 doors, no windows, enough room for me and a desk. It was very cozy. And I tend to work off of my laptop a lot. My laptop's a 15-inch Mac. What I really needed was a large monitor to hook the laptop up to, and a separate keyboard, a large print keyboard, and a mouse and stuff like that. Zoom Text and I don't get along. For those of you who know Zoom Text, I'm going to tell you right now, it's a pile of crap. It doesn't work with science. It works for reading a newspaper. It doesn't work for complex programs. And so it's useless to me. So anyway, try telling Freedom Scientific that. They're the ones who are like, yeah, it wasn't built for you, so we don't care. It's like, well, that's not very helpful. So the ergonomist came. He said, show me how you work. I showed him. And the way I work, because for me, things have to be big and things have to be readable. So what that means is if it's a small screen, it's got to be close to my face. If it's small print, it's got to be close to my face. And so for me, my nose is about 3 inches away from the laptop screen. I'm hunched over the keyboard like this. For those of you who are able to see, it leads to like Hunchback of Notre Dame syndrome, right? It causes serious spinal problems, and you need like chiropractic and massage therapy and everything else. It gets expensive. So I hunched over my keyboard and I was poking at the screen, and he said, okay, here's what you're going to do. I said, what am I going to do? He said, sit back. I did. He said, put your wrists on the table. I did. He said, push the keyboard and screen backwards so that they're at least 3 feet away from your face. I said, okay. He said, we can only get you a 21-inch monitor. I said, why? He said, you can't turn your neck when you're reading. I said, why not? He said, that does things to your spine. I said, well, that's nice. There's a problem. He said, what's that? I said, I have nystagmus. I can't control how my eyeballs move, which means, by the way, that I'm not focusing on any of you, because if I tried to focus on any of you, it would hurt like the dickens. And so when I read, my head actually moves like a typewriter. There are a few things about my specific case that are weird if you think about it from the visual impairment perspective. I read 200 pages an hour, and my head actually moves like a typewriter in order for me to do that. How many of you actually remember what a typewriter is? Okay, good. Enough of you in the room. If I ever said that to a grade school class, nobody would clap, right? So my head moves like the head of a typewriter. It was actually bizarre. One time on a bus, I was reading a novel, and it was pressed up against my nose. And I kid you not, the high school kids on the other end of the bus saw me doing this, stared, and said, holy F, what the F are you doing, F? I ignored them. I pretended that I was deaf as well as blind. My wife, by the way, is hard of hearing, and so I make the totally politically incorrect joke of being half of a deaf-blind couple. Laugh, it's just as funny as I think it's funny, but there's also a lot of people who'd be like, that's gross and totally disrespectful, to which I would say, probably, but if we can't make a joke about our disability and our lived experience, then no one else is going to be able to do it, and I need people to laugh with me. But anyway, the ergonomist did not understand that I had nystagmus and couldn't see a 21-inch monitor if it was 3 feet away from my face. And I explained this to him, and he was like, okay, I can't help you. And I said, you're supposed to be able to help me. You're my first point of contact to figure out how you can help me. We went through a 3-month exercise that ended up with me getting no accommodation from my employer. And so employers, by and large, suck. Mostly because their HR policies when it comes to disability are built for people who break their legs. My wife had a brain tumor that sat inside her head for 6 years, and we finally got it out last April. And thank you very much. It was a benign brain tumor, but the thing about brain tumors is it's not what they are, it's where they sit. This one was hanging out on her brainstem, all cranial nerves. It was not a good place for it to be. And they had her back to work 15 weeks after she went on medical leave for the surgery. She had brainstem surgery. The surgery lasted 11 and a half hours, and they had her back to work in 15 weeks. Why? Because their return to work policies are geared toward people who break their legs, are geared toward people who have very short-term, very temporary disabilities, and are geared toward people with repetitive stress syndrome, right? Both of us work in healthcare. And you know, she works at a hospital in Kingston, Ontario, and I work at CNIB. And the challenge ends up being that employers, small, medium, large, doesn't matter, employers are thinking about disability not in terms of people who live with disability on a daily basis. They're thinking about, oh, you broke your leg, you broke your hand, you know, you got into a car accident, you did something. I can see that you did something because you're walking in with a cast, or you're hobbling in with a cast, or you know, you're rolling in with a cast or whatever, and that cast is going to come off. It's temporary, right? The interesting thing, by the way, in the space is there's really good data in the context of medical education that shows, and I'm willing to bet you dollars to donuts that this is the same in just about any STEM-related discipline. If you look at people who acquire disabilities, graduate from medical school after they've gone through their residency, the field takes very good care of them, right? Because as far as they're concerned, you've earned your stripes, you belong, right? They'll figure out how to help you because you're one of them. But if you have a disability and then you try to get into medical school, it's hell on wheels, right? I have a mentee who is actually the first blind medical student in Canada. She was, watch my wording here, she was doing her medical education at the Northern Ontario School of Medicine based in Sudbury, Ontario and Thunder Bay in Ontario. She got to halfway through her second year, and then she went on permanent academic leave because they thought they couldn't accommodate her, and she was too frustrated to figure out how to solve it. She's going to go into social work. Absolutely, it sucks. That is why I do this. That's why I actually came here. This is why I spend, because I don't always get to spend company money to do this. This is why I spend, and Ainsley agrees with me, this is why we spend our own time and our own effort to have these kinds of conversations, because it's absolutely important to have these conversations. In today's world, we can actually envision a space where equity, diversity, and inclusion, particularly around accessibility in STEM, a professional discipline. That we can do this as a job, and we can do this to make a difference for the next generation and the generation after that. When I started doing this, nobody would envision this being a job. Nobody would actually give me funding to do this. The 2 of the 3 projects that I told you about were bankrolled from my bank account. And I'm not telling you that because I'm rich, I'm not. I'm telling you that because I'm passionate about them and they needed to be done, right? And nobody would actually pay for it because nobody actually thinks it's a deal, right? Because the PhD graduation rate the graduation rate of PhDs with disabilities is tiny, right? The raw numbers are tiny, right? And what is it? The last NSF survey I saw, I think there's like 5,000 PhD graduates with disabilities. That was from 2017, right? Those numbers are small, right? 5,000 out of a population of 300 million, right? Nobody cares, right? But at the end of the day, it's a conversation worth having because so many people within the population live with some lived experience and go to school with some lived experience and come out the other side and wonder, what the hell are we going to do next? What is our employment prospect? And our employment prospects are tremendously poor, right? 42% of people who are blind in Canada have a job. Never mind a full-time job, they have a job. The number in the United States, I think, is like 43 or 44%. It's very similar. It was the last time you looked. The last time I checked with somebody from Missouri State University, they suggested to me that it was 44. But it depends on how you count employment. Because the funny thing is if you actually count employment as working 30 hours a week or more, in Canada, the number is 28%, which is very similar to the 29%. So a lot of it depends on how you actually count it. And we can debate that for hours. But we probably don't have the time to do that because, you know, lunch is calling you. So the point that I'm driving at is that, you know, that first degree relationship and that attempt to get at the employer in such a way so that they respect and understand that those policies don't work, that's where we're actually going to start to have that conversation effectively. And as the workforce ages, it actually helps us. Number one, as the workforce ages, the workforce gets more disabilities and their employers are going to have to figure out how to deal with that, right? Because if you choose to let all those people go, you've got to replace them somehow, and a large pool of people to replace them with sits in this room, right? And in rooms just like it across the continent and across the world, right? And so getting people to acknowledge that is the work of the next 5 or 10 years, right? And getting people to acknowledge that this is a professional conversation worth having with evidence basis and research is a conversation worth having, and that's why we're here. That's my mic drop moment in case anyone lunch.